Mujin had been silent for 2,555 days when the coffee hit his shoulder. Hot, dark, deliberate. A rival lieutenant standing over him, grinning like he'd already won. The entire diner went still, forks frozen midair, conversations dying in throats. Everyone waiting for the legendary boss to do what he always did, nothing. Just that cold, unreadable stare that had buried better men than this. Then she moved. The waitress, Mitchell, her name tag read, stepped between them with a tray still balanced in one hand. "Sir, I'm so sorry about the mess," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. Before Mujin could slide his notepad from his pocket, before his men could reach for their concealed weapons, she did something that shattered 7 years of carefully constructed silence. She leaned down and kissed him. The absolute insanity of it stopped time itself. Her lips pressed against his soft, warm, tasting faintly of mint and panic. Not passionate. Not romantic. A desperate, clumsy act of defiance against men who thought they could humiliate someone in her section. Her hand braced against his shoulder for balance, and Mujin felt something crack inside his chest. Not his ribs. Something deeper. Something that had been locked behind steel and scars and the weight of a brother's funeral. When she pulled back, her brown eyes were wide with mortification and adrenaline, searching his face like she'd just realized she'd kissed a man who could have her disappeared with a gesture. But Mujin wasn't looking at her anymore. He was staring at the lieutenant, who'd gone pale as winter, at the diner full of witnesses, at his own hands that had instinctively, impossibly reached up to touch where her warmth still lingered on his lips. And then, for the first time since his brother's blood had soaked into concrete, Mujin opened his mouth and spoke. "Get out." The voice that emerged was gravel and rust, a sound scraped from the bottom of a well, but it filled the diner like thunder. The rivals stumbled backward. Mujin's own men froze, some with tears in their eyes. And the young waitress, who had just unlocked a ghost, stood there in her worn uniform, hand over her mouth, realizing she'd just done something that would change both their lives forever. Mujin woke at 5:47 a.m., exactly as he had for the past 7 years. No alarm. No sound. Just the weight of consciousness pressing down like a hand over his mouth. He dressed in the dark, charcoal suit, white shirt pressed with military precision, the heavy steel watch that had stopped keeping accurate time somewhere around day 400. His reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a man carved from stone and silence. The scar near his jawline caught the dim light. He didn't touch it. He never did. Breakfast was black coffee and yesterday's rice, eaten standing at the kitchen counter while reading reports his men had left in a manila folder by the door. Revenue numbers. Territory disputes. A list of names, some circled in red, meaning problems that needed solving. He wrote his responses in neat Korean script on sticky notes, his handwriting the only voice his empire heard anymore. The car arrived at 6:30. His driver, Min-soo, had learned years ago not to attempt small talk. The silence in the back seat was a living thing, thick enough to choke on. Mujin watched the city blur past, neon signs going dark as dawn crept over Seoul, street vendors setting up their carts, ordinary people living ordinary lives with ordinary voices. He used to talk. Before his brother's wedding that never happened. Before the ambush outside the hotel. Before Jae-sung had pushed him aside and taken the bullets meant for the eldest son. Before Mujin had held his baby brother and felt warm blood seep between his fingers while his own screams tore his throat raw. After that, there were no words left worth saying. At the office, his men stood when he entered, bowing with the kind of respect reserved for ghosts and gods. He acknowledged them with a slight nod, then disappeared into his private room where the walls were soundproofed and the desk was clear except for a single framed photograph he kept face down. The meetings were always the same. His underboss, Kang, would speak. Mujin would listen with that unreadable stare, then write his commands on expensive cardstock. Sometimes a single word, wait, negotiate, end it. The men had learned to read the pressure of his pen, the speed of his strokes. Anger lived in the thickness of his ink. By evening, his jaw ached from clenching. His hands were stone still on the armrest of his chair. The weight he carried wasn't just grief anymore, it was the accumulated pressure of 2,555 days of swallowed rage, unspoken apologies, and a voice that had calcified somewhere deep in his chest like a fossil. He left the office at 9:15 p.m. and told his driver to take him somewhere different. Somewhere cheap and bright and full of people whose lives hadn't stopped 7 years ago. The diner's neon sign buzzed like a living thing. Mujin stepped inside, and for the first time in 2,555 days, felt something shift in the silence. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and disinfectant, nothing like the expensive restaurants where his men usually took him. Mujin chose a booth in the back corner, positioning himself where he could see both exits. Old habits. His bodyguard, Taewon, sat 3 tables away, pretending to read a newspaper. She appeared with a pot of coffee and a smile that seemed genuinely meant for him, not the expensive suit or the dangerous stillness he wore like armor. Evening. Just you tonight. Her voice carried a soft warmth, accented in a way that marked her as American-born, maybe second generation. Mujin pointed to the coffee cup, then held up one finger. Coffee, got it. Need a minute with the menu. He nodded once. She left the laminated menu and moved on, her ponytail swinging with an easy confidence that came from someone who'd never had reason to fear the kind of men who inhabited his world. The name tag pinned slightly crooked on her uniform read Mitchell. He was studying the menu, not reading it, just maintaining the appearance of normalcy, when the diner door opened and 3 men walked in wearing expensive suits that didn't quite fit. Kim Jae-ho's crew. Young. Loud. Hungry for the kind of reputation you built by disrespecting legends. Mujin felt Taewon tense across the room. He gave the slightest shake of his head. Not here. Not now. The lieutenant, Hansu, a middle manager with more ambition than sense, spotted him immediately. The grin that spread across his face was the kind that preceded stupid decisions. He grabbed a coffee pot from the counter, ignoring Mitchell's protest, and walked straight to Mujin's booth. Well, the great Mujin. Out here slumming with the rest of us. Hansu's Korean was deliberately crude, meant to provoke. I heard you lost your voice. That true, old man. Mujin met his eyes with the stare that had made grown men confess to crimes they hadn't committed. Empty. Patient. Promising nothing but the inevitable. Hansu lifted the coffee pot. What's wrong? Cat got your. The coffee hit Mujin's shoulder, hot and dark, soaking through the expensive fabric. The diner went silent. Silverware stopped mid-clatter. Conversations died. Even the kitchen noise seemed to fade. Mujin didn't move. Didn't reach for the napkins. Didn't blink. Hansu laughed, encouraged by the lack of response. See? Nothing but Then Mitchell was there, tray balanced in one hand, stepping between them with the kind of reckless bravery that came from not understanding the stakes. Sir, I'm so sorry about the mess. Her voice trembled but held. Mujin's hand moved toward his jacket pocket, toward the notepad where his voice lived in ink. And then she kissed him. The world narrowed to the softness of her lips, the sharp intake of her breath, the warmth of her hand bracing against his shoulder. Something in his chest cracked open like a door that had been sealed shut, and air rushed in where there had been only stone and silence. She pulled back, eyes wide with the dawning horror of what she'd just done. Mujin's throat burned. His hands moved without permission, touching his own lips where her warmth still lingered. He looked at Hansu, who'd gone pale, and spoke. Get out. The voice was destroyed. Gravel scraped over rust. But it filled every corner of the diner like thunder after 7 years of drought. Hansu and his crew fled like roaches when the lights came on. Mujin sat in the coffee-stained booth, his throat still burning from those 2 words, and watched the waitress disappear into the kitchen. She didn't come back out. Not while he waited. Not when Taewon paid the bill with enough cash to cover a week's worth of coffee. Not even when Mujin stood at the door for a full minute, staring at the space where she'd been. By the time they reached the car, his voice had already retreated back into silence, but something fundamental had changed. The air tasted different. His chest felt hollow and vast, like a room that had been locked for years suddenly opened to let the light in. "Find her," he wrote on a card and handed it to Taewon. It should have been simple. The diner had employee records. She'd worn a name tag. But when Kong called the next morning, his voice carried the careful tone of a man delivering bad news to someone who'd recently remembered how to kill with words. "The name on her application was incomplete, sir. Just Mitchell O. No permanent address listed. The manager says she's worked there 3 months, always shows up on time, never causes problems. Paid under the table." Moojin's pen pressed hard enough against the paper to tear it. "Keep looking." It took his men 2 days to find her, and when they did, the report landed on his desk like an indictment of the world's fairness. Mitchell Okoro, 24 years old. No family in Seoul. Student visa that had expired 6 months ago, which meant she was living in the margins, invisible to systems that should have protected her. She worked the diner from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m., then took a bus across the city to clean office buildings from 4 a.m. to 10 a.m. 6 hours of sleep if she was lucky. The photographs Kang's men had taken showed her slumped against a bus window, eyes closed, still wearing the diner uniform because she didn't have time to go home and change. Moojin studied the images spread across his desk. Her face in profile, exhausted but peaceful in sleep. The worn fabric of her uniform. The cheap canvas bag clutched in her lap that probably held everything valuable she owned. This woman who had stepped between him and humiliation, who had kissed a monster to save him, was grinding herself to dust just to survive in a city that didn't want her. The unfairness of it settled in his chest like a stone. He picked up his phone, the one he never used because his voice had been gone, and stared at it for a long moment. His throat felt raw just thinking about speaking again. But he pressed Kang's number anyway and waited through 2 rings before his underboss answered with barely concealed shock. "Bring her to me," Moojin said, his voice like shattered glass. "Make sure she knows it's not a threat." The silence on the other end spoke volumes. "And Kong," Moojin added, each word costing him something. "Make sure she's safe until she arrives." He ended the call and sat in the soundproofed quiet, touching his throat where her kiss had broken 7 years of carefully maintained death. They brought her to his office at noon, and Moojin could see the fear trying to hide behind her squared shoulders. She wore the same diner uniform, probably because she'd been pulled from her shift. Her eyes moved over the expensive furniture, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seoul, the men in dark suits standing like sentries. When her gaze finally landed on him, something flickered across her face. Recognition, yes, but also a flash of defiance that reminded him why she'd been brave enough to kiss a stranger. "Miss Okoro," Kong began in English, his accent thick but functional. "Mr. Park would like to." Moojin held up one hand. Kong went silent. The room held its breath. He slid a paper across the desk toward her. The offer was written in both Korean and English. Personal assistant. Salary that would cover a year's worth of her current combined income in a single month. Benefits. Visa sponsorship. Housing. Mitchell read it twice, her finger tracing the numbers like she thought they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. When she looked up, her expression had hardened into something close to anger. "No." Her voice was steady. "I don't know what this is, but I don't want any part of it." Moojin's pen moved across a notepad. "You need help." "I need help." Simple. Kong translated, but Mitchell was already shaking her head, ponytail swinging with emotion. "I kissed you to stop them from hurting you. That doesn't mean I owe you anything, and you definitely don't owe me this." She gestured at the paper like it was contaminated. "Not debt," Moojin wrote. "Opportunity." "For who?" "You." Her brown eyes flashed. "I've seen enough movies to know how this works. Rich man. Poor girl. She becomes convenient until she's not." She stood, the chair scraping against the floor. "Thank you for the offer, but I'll figure out my own life." The words hit harder than they should have. Mujin watched her turn toward the door, watched her prepared to walk away from money that could change everything, and felt something crack open wider in his chest. He didn't want an assistant. He wanted the woman who'd seen him humiliated and hadn't looked away. The woman who'd chosen kindness over safety. His throat burned as he forced air through his vocal cords. Wait. The single word stopped her mid-step. She turned slowly, eyes wide. Mujin stood, his hands gripping the desk edge to keep them from shaking. Speaking still felt like swallowing glass, each word a small violence against 7 years of silence. I don't know how to be in the world anymore. The confession came out broken, honest. You made me speak. Maybe you can teach me how to mean it. The defiance in her expression softened into something more complicated. She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time seemed to see past the tailored suit and the scars and the reputation. She saw the lonely man who'd forgotten his own voice. 1 month, she said finally. Trial basis. And I'm not your property. Mujin nodded, not trusting himself to speak again. But the relief that flooded through him tasted like the first breath after drowning. The apartment Mujin provided was smaller than she'd expected, 1 bedroom overlooking a quiet street, furnished simply but well. Mitchell had expected something lavish, a gilded cage to match the money he was paying her. Instead, she got whitewashed walls and a kitchen that actually looked used. The first morning, she found him already there, sitting at the dining table with his notepad and that heavy steel watch catching the early light. He pushed a cup of coffee toward her. Black, no sugar. Exactly how she'd drunk it at the diner. You remembered, she said, then felt foolish for being surprised. Mujin's pen moved. I remember everything. She sat across from him, close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders held themselves rigid like he was always braced for impact. We should start small, she said. Just talking. Nothing complicated. He stared at her with those intense, unreadable eyes. Say my name, Mitchell said gently. Just that. Mitchell. His throat worked. She watched the struggle play out across his face, the instinct to retreat back into silence warring with something newer, more fragile. His lips parted. Closed. Parted again. Mitch. The sound came out rough, unfinished. He stopped, frustration darkening his expression. That's okay. Try again. There's no rush. Mitchell. Closer, but still wrong, the syllables clumsy in his mouth like a language he'd forgotten. Mitchell, she corrected softly, saying it slowly. M-I-T-Chell. M-I-T-Chell. This time it landed right, and something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but a softening around his eyes that felt like victory. Good, she said, and meant it. They fell into a rhythm over the following days. Mornings were for words. She'd bring him coffee and they'd sit at the table while she coaxed sounds from him like drawing water from a stone. Simple things first. Yes. No. Please. Thank you. Each word cost him something. She could see it in the way he'd touch his throat afterward, in the tremor that sometimes caught his hands. But he kept trying. One afternoon, she found him alone in his study, staring at the photograph he kept face down on his desk. His fingers hovered over the frame, but didn't lift it. Your brother, she asked quietly. Mujin nodded once. The silence stretched between them, heavy with grief that predated her by 7 years. You don't have to talk about it, Mitchell said. But when you're ready, I'll listen. He picked up his pen, but for once didn't write. Instead, he looked at her with an expression so raw it felt like witnessing something sacred. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Jae-sung. The name came out broken, barely more than a whisper. His name was Jae-sung. Mitchell reached across the desk and covered his hand with hers. He didn't pull away. For a long moment, they sat like that, her warmth against his stone, while he learned what it meant to speak the names of the dead without drowning in silence. Thank you, he said, the words still rough but genuine. For being here. And she understood that he wasn't just thanking her for the job, but for treating his voice like something worth saving. It was raining the night Mujin finally told her everything. They'd been working together for 3 weeks, and Mitchell had learned to read the silences between his words, the way his jaw would tighten when memories pressed too close, how his fingers would trace the scar near his jawline when he was deciding whether to speak or retreat. He'd called her to his private office after everyone else had gone home. The city lights blurred through rain-streaked windows, and he sat in the chair across from his desk rather than behind it. An offering of equal ground. Mitchell settled beside him, close enough to see the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. Jae-sung was supposed to get married, Moojin began, his voice still rough but stronger than it had been. 26 years old. Beautiful fiancé. Whole life ahead of him. He stared at his hands, at the steel watch that caught the dim light. He wanted out. Out of the family business. Out of the violence. But you couldn't let him go? Mitchell asked gently. I encouraged it. The words came harder now, weighted with old guilt. Told him to be happy. To be normal. His throat worked. The rival families saw it as weakness. My father's air going soft. They decided to send a message. Mitchell waited, giving him space to breathe between sentences. They came for me. Outside the hotel the night before the wedding. 3 men with guns. Moojin's hand moved to the scar on his jaw, touching it like he could still feel the blade. Jae-sung was supposed to be inside with his bride. But he saw them. Saw what was coming. The rain intensified against the windows, filling the silence. He pushed me out of the way, Moojin continued, each word scraped raw. Took the bullets meant for me. 4 of them. I held him while he died. His voice cracked. He tried to say something at the end. Moved his lips. But no sound came out. Just blood. Mitchell's hand found his, fingers threading through his with quiet solidarity. I screamed until my throat bled, Moojin said. Screamed until security came. Until my father's men arrived. Until they covered Jae-sung's body with a sheet. He looked at her then, his eyes reflecting years of restrained anguish. And then I stopped. Because what was the point? My voice couldn't bring him back. Couldn't tell him I was sorry. Couldn't fix what my existence had broken. He unfastened the steel watch from his wrist with trembling fingers and held it out to her. This was his. He wore it every day. It stopped at 11:47 p.m. The exact moment his voice failed him. Mitchell took the watch carefully, feeling the weight of 7 years of silence pressing into her palm. The frozen hands. The scratched crystal. A monument to the second when everything ended. You've been carrying him, she said softly. Wearing his time because yours stopped too. Moojin nodded, and for the first time since his brother's death, allowed tears to fall without hiding them. Mitchell pulled him close, and he collapsed against her shoulder like a building finally giving way to inevitable ruin, his silent sobs shaking them both while the rain washed the windows clean. The call came at 2:47 a.m. Moojin answered before the second ring, years of instinct pulling him from sleep. Kang's voice was tight with barely controlled fury. The diner. They hit the diner. Moojin was dressed and moving before Kang finished explaining. Mitchell emerged from her room, eyes still heavy with sleep, but alert enough to read the violence gathering in his silence. What happened? She asked. Get dressed, he said, the words sharp. Come with me. The diner looked like a war zone. Shattered glass glittered across the sidewalk under harsh police lights. The neon sign that had buzzed with life now hung crooked, half the letters dark. Someone had spray-painted a message across the front window in red, "The Mute King Bleeds." Moojin stood across the street, his hands clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. Taewon appeared beside him, his report delivered in clipped Korean. Kim Jae-ho's crew. 6 men. They came after closing, roughed up the night manager, smashed everything. Said they were looking for the boss's whore. The word hit Moojin like a physical blow. He felt Mitchell stiffen beside him, her hand finding his arm. They asked about me, she said quietly. Not a question. Moojin turned to her, and she saw something dangerous flickering behind his eyes, the restrained rage that had lived dormant for 7 years now stirring awake. They wanted to send a message, he said, his voice low and rough. That I've gone soft. That caring about someone makes me weak. And does it? Mitchell asked, though her voice trembled. He looked at the destroyed diner, at the place where she'd worked herself to exhaustion, where she'd kissed him and broken his silence. The owner, an older woman who'd given Mitchell a chance when no one else would, was sitting on the curb with a blanket around her shoulders, crying. No, Mujin said, each word deliberate. It makes me dangerous. He crossed the street with purpose, Mitchell trailing behind. The owner looked up, fear flashing across her face when she recognized him, but Mujin crouched down to her level, making himself smaller, less threatening. Mrs. Cho, he said in Korean, the language still feeling foreign after so long. I'm sorry this happened. This was meant for me. The woman stared at him, then at Mitchell, understanding dawning in her tear-stained eyes. I'll have this rebuilt, Mujin continued. Better than before. And I'll make sure no one touches you or your business again. He paused, his jaw working. You gave her a job when she needed one. That means something. Mrs. Cho nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Mujin stood, pulling out his phone. When Kang answered, his voice carried a command that made even Mitchell take a step back. Find Hansu. Find everyone who is there tonight. And tell Kim Jae-ho that the mute king wants to have a conversation. He ended the call and looked at Mitchell, his expression hard, but his eyes holding something almost apologetic. They wanted to see if I could still roar. I'm going to show them exactly what 7 years of silence sounds like when it breaks. The conference room held 30 men, lieutenants, enforcers, the core of Mujin's organization. They sat in rigid silence, confusion written across their faces. For 7 years, their boss had communicated through notes and gestures. Now they'd been summoned at dawn with no explanation, only the tension radiating from Kang's clipped summons. Mujin stood at the head of the table, Mitchell positioned slightly behind him in the shadows. He'd asked her to be there, though he hadn't explained why. She understood anyway. She was his anchor, the reminder that his voice was something worth using. He looked at the faces of men who'd followed him through silence, who'd learned to read his anger in the thickness of ink and the pressure of pen. Some were old enough to remember what he'd sounded like before. Others had only known the mute king. His throat felt raw already, and he hadn't spoken yet. I know you're confused, Mujin began, and the room collectively froze. His voice was still rough, still carried the gravel of disuse, but it filled the space with undeniable authority. For 7 years, I've led you without words. Some of you thought it made me weak. Some thought it made me untouchable. He paused, letting the weight of sound settle over them. Last night, Kim Jae-ho's crew attacked a civilian business, terrorized an old woman, destroyed property that meant nothing to our war. His hands gripped the table edge. They did it because they think I've gone soft. Because I've started speaking again. Because they believe a voice makes me vulnerable. Taewon leaned forward, his expression fierce with loyalty. Others mirrored him, a ripple of understanding moving through the room. They're wrong, Mujin said, each word deliberate. My silence was never strength. It was a grave I climbed into with my brother. It was death pretending to breathe. He looked at each man in turn, his gaze cutting. But I'm done being dead. The room held its collective breath. Kim Jae-ho thinks he's fighting a ghost. He's not. Mujin's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. He's fighting a man who just remembered he has teeth. And I want him to understand what that means. He pulled out a photograph, surveillance of Hansu entering a hostess bar, and slid it across the table. Find him. Bring him to the warehouse on Pier 9. Alive. Kong stood, followed by the others, a wave of movement that signaled absolute compliance. And understand this, Mujin continued, his voice cutting through the shuffling. Anyone who touches innocent people to get to me will learn that my silence was mercy. My voice is judgment. The men filed out with renewed purpose, energy crackling through them like electricity. Mujin remained standing until the last one left. Then his shoulders sagged slightly, the performance of strength giving way to exhaustion. Mitchell stepped forward, her hand finding his lower back. You did it, she said softly. I sounded like myself, he replied, wonder mixing with weariness in his tone. I sounded alive. You are alive, Mitchell said. And they just remembered why they should be terrified of that. Mitchell found him in his study 3 hours later, staring at surveillance footage on his laptop. The screen showed a man, Hansu. She recognized him from the diner, being dragged into a warehouse by Taewon and 2 others. The timestamp read 4:23 a.m. They have him, Moojin said without looking up. His voice carried no emotion, just flat statement of fact. She moved closer, watching the screen. Hansu was shouting, struggling against the hands that held him. On the desk beside the laptop sat a handgun, cleaned and oiled, catching the morning light. What are you going to do? Mitchell asked, though part of her didn't want to know. What I should have done when he disrespected me at the diner. Moojin finally looked at her, and his eyes held that cold, unreadable stare she'd first seen, the one that promised violence without flinching. Make an example. The words settled between them like stones. Moojin. He called you a whore, he interrupted, his voice hardening. He destroyed a woman's livelihood to prove I was weak. These aren't misunderstandings, Mitchell. This is war. She watched him stand, watched him check the gun with practiced efficiency, and felt something cold crawl up her spine. This wasn't the man who'd cried on her shoulder. This wasn't the man who'd struggled to say her name with tenderness. This was someone else wearing his face, someone carved from the same violence that had taken his brother. Is this what I did? The question came out smaller than she intended. When I kissed you, when I made you speak again, did I just wake up something that should have stayed buried? Moojin stopped, the gun frozen in his hand. He looked at her like she'd struck him. You think you created this? He asked quietly. I think I opened a door I didn't understand. Mitchell's voice trembled. I thought I was helping you heal, but maybe I just reminded you how to hurt people. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 7 years of accumulated rage and 4 weeks of fragile hope pulling in opposite directions. I was always this, Moojin said finally, setting the gun down. The silence didn't make me peaceful. It made me a coward. I let men disrespect me because I was too broken to fight back. He moved toward her, slowly, like approaching something that might flee. You didn't create a monster, Mitchell. You just reminded me I was still a man. And men protect what they care about. By killing people? By doing what's necessary. His hand reached for hers, but stopped short, hovering in the space between them. I know what I am. I've always known. But I also know that without you, I'd still be that ghost in the wheelchair of my own making, letting the world happen around me. Mitchell looked at his outstretched hand, at the scars on his knuckles, at the gentleness trying to exist alongside the violence. I don't know if I can watch you become this. Then don't watch, Moojin said, and the sadness in his voice nearly broke her. But don't ask me to let them hurt you and do nothing. I already buried one person I loved because I wasn't strong enough to protect them. The confession hung between them, raw and bleeding. Mitchell saw the man and the monster trying to coexist in the same skin and understood that maybe they always had been. Mitchell needed air. She left Moojin in his study with his gun and his ghosts and took the elevator down to the street level, ignoring the protest from Taewon about protocol. She just needed to walk. To think. To breathe something that didn't smell like expensive leather and impending violence. The coffee shop 3 blocks away was unremarkable, the kind of place that served decent Americanos to office workers who didn't look twice at anyone. She ordered, found a seat by the window, and tried to sort through the tangle of fear and care and moral confusion that Moojin had become in her mind. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. He's going to get you killed. You know that, right? Mitchell's hand tightened around her cup. She typed back, "Who is this?" The response came immediately. Someone who wants to help. The parking garage across the street. 5 minutes. Come alone. Every instinct screamed trap. But the message had found her personal number, which meant someone close to Moojin. Someone who knew where she was right now. She looked around the coffee shop, tourists, students, a businessman on his laptop. No one paying attention to her. She crossed the street against her better judgment. The parking garage was dim and nearly empty, her footsteps echoing off concrete. A figure emerged from behind a pillar, young, maybe 30, wearing a suit that marked him as one of Mujean's. She recognized him vaguely from the conference room. "Miss Okoro," he said in accented English. "My name is Sungmin. I work for Mr. Park. What do you want?" "To warn you." He glanced over his shoulder nervously. "The boss, he's changed. Become reckless. Emotional. It's making him weak, and weak leaders get people killed." Mitchell took a step back. "If you're trying to turn me against him." "I'm trying to save you," Sungmin interrupted. "Kim Jae-ho's people, they know about you. They know you're his weakness. And Mr. Park, he's so focused on protecting you that he's not seeing the bigger picture. The whole organization is at risk." Something felt wrong. The way he stood. The way his eyes kept darting to the shadows behind her. Mitchell turned too late. The cloth came over her mouth and nose, chemical sweet and suffocating. She tried to scream, to fight, but her limbs went heavy. The last thing she saw was Sungmin's face, guilt and greed warring in his expression as he pocketed what looked like a thick envelope. "I'm sorry," he said, and he might have even meant it. But they paid better than loyalty. The world tilted sideways. Strong hands caught her before she hit the ground. Voices spoke in rapid Korean above her head, instructions, directions, something about a warehouse and making sure the boss saw the video. Then darkness swallowed everything, and Mitchell disappeared into it like smoke. When Taewon found her empty coffee cup 40 minutes later, and no sign of her anywhere, his call to Mujean carried only 3 words: "She's gone, sir." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 2 seconds before Mujean's voice came through, sharp as breaking glass. "Find her. Burn everything until you find her." And somewhere in a warehouse across the city, Mitchell woke to zip ties cutting into her wrists and the smell of rust and fear. Mujean didn't wait for intelligence. Didn't wait for strategy. The moment Kang's men traced Sungmin's phone to the industrial district, he was moving 15 vehicles, 40 men, and a rage that had been building for 7 years finally given direction. He rode in the lead car, no longer hidden in the back seat, but sitting forward, visible. The gun felt natural in his hand now, an extension of the violence he'd been swallowing since Jae-sung's blood had soaked into his shirt. Taewon drove with his jaw clenched, navigating the midnight streets like they were going to war. They were. The warehouse loomed against the dark sky, lights burning in the upper windows. Kim Jae-ho's crew had gotten sloppy with confidence, assuming the Mute King would negotiate, would hesitate, would play it safe. They didn't know he'd stopped being the Mute King the moment Mitchell kissed him. Mujean stepped out of the car before it fully stopped. His men fanned out behind him, weapons drawn but waiting for the command. He looked up at those lit windows and felt something break loose in his chest, not the careful crack of healing, but the violent rupture of a dam that had held too long. "Kang," he said, his voice carrying across the assembly. "Front entrance. Taewon, loading dock. Everyone else, surround the building. No one leaves." The commands came easy now, natural. His voice wasn't just sound anymore, it was authority made audible. "And when we're inside," Mujean continued, his tone dropping to something darker, "anyone between me and her becomes a memory." They moved like a machine, coordinated and lethal. The front door exploded inward under Kang's battering ram. Mujean walked through the smoke and splintered wood into chaos, shouting men, scrambling bodies, the sharp crack of gunfire that he'd heard in nightmares for 7 years. But this time he wasn't frozen. This time he wasn't watching his brother die. "First floor clear," someone shouted. "Keep moving." Mujean roared back, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "She's upstairs." He took the stairs 3 at a time, Taewon and 4 others behind him. A guard appeared at the landing, young, terrified, barely old enough to shave. He raised his gun with shaking hands. "Drop it or die," Mujean said, and the boy heard death in those 4 words. The weapon clattered to the floor. The upper level was a maze of storage rooms and offices. Mujean kicked open each door, systematic and relentless. Behind the third door, He found Hansu standing over Mitchell, who was bound to a chair, her lips split and bleeding. Hansu's gun came up. One more step and Mujin shot him through the shoulder before he finished the threat. The man crumpled with a scream. That was for the coffee, Mujin said, his voice absolutely calm. He crossed to Mitchell, holstering his weapon and pulling a knife to cut her restraints. This is for touching her. He didn't kill Hansu. Death was too quick, too merciful. Instead, he looked at Taewon. Make sure Kim Jae-ho understands what happens when you take things that belong to me. Then Mujin gathered Mitchell into his arms, her body trembling against his chest, and carried her out of that warehouse like she weighed nothing. Behind them, Hansu's screaming echoed through the building, a message written in pain that the mute king was dead, and the man who replaced him had learned to roar. The rain had started again by the time they reached his apartment, washing the city clean the way it had the night he'd told her about Jae-sung. Mujin had refused to let the medics treat her at the scene, carrying her to his car himself, his jacket wrapped around her shoulders. Now she sat on his bathroom counter while he cleaned the cut on her lip with careful, trembling hands. You came for me, Mitchell said quietly. Her voice was hoarse, raw from screaming. Did you think I wouldn't? Mujin's hands stilled, the antiseptic-soaked cotton hovering near her face. I thought. She looked down at her wrists, at the raw marks left by zip ties. After what I said. About you being a monster. About not wanting to watch you become this. Her eyes filled. I thought maybe you'd decide I wasn't worth the trouble. Mujin set down the cotton and cupped her face with both hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. Mitchell. Her name came out rough but tender. You kissed me in a diner to save me from humiliation. You taught me how to say your name. You sat with me while I cried over my brother. His thumbs brushed away the tears sliding down her cheeks. You think any of that made you disposable? I was afraid, she whispered. I know. He rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in alive, safe here. I am what you saw. I won't lie about that. I hurt people. I give orders that end lives. I exist in a world where violence is the language everyone speaks. He pulled back just enough to see her eyes. But with you, I'm learning a different language. One I forgot I knew. What language is that? Hope, Mujin said simply. The belief that I can be more than what grief made me. That I deserve to exist in more than just silence and shadows. Mitchell's hand found his scarred jaw, tracing the line where a blade had once cut deep. I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to be honest. Then here's my truth. He took a shaky breath, preparing for the longest sentence he'd spoken since his brother died. I love you, Mitchell Okoro. Not because you saved me, though you did. Not because you gave me back my voice, though you did that too. I love you because when you look at me, you see a man worth saving, and that makes me want to be worthy of that sight. The words hung between them, no longer rough or broken, but clear and deliberate. A promise made with sound instead of silence. Mitchell pulled him close, her kiss nothing like that first desperate act in the diner. This one was soft, intentional, tasting of rain and relief and futures neither of them had thought possible 4 weeks ago. When they finally pulled apart, Mujin's steel watch, Jae-sung's watch, sat on the counter beside them. He picked it up, looked at the frozen hands, and for the first time in 7 years, unfastened it from his wrist completely. Time to let go, he said quietly. Mitchell took his hand, her fingers threading through his. And time to move forward. Outside, Seoul breathed around them, indifferent to small miracles. But inside that apartment, a man who'd been silent for 2,555 days held the woman who'd taught him how to speak again and promised her with every word he could find that he would never stop trying to say the truth. The end.